What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? Last time on Richard Carrier's interview on this channel, he mentioned this at the very end.
And I think that's really the main thing. Is like if it wasn't a religion that society was so dependent on financially, academically, culturally, socially, that this wouldn't be a hot button issue, really. Like there would be people would be much more open to non-existence of Jesus, and even the experts would be.
So what we're going to do is we're going to pick up today with that thought, and we're going to go into a few things like arguments from authority, as well as whether or not Christianity depends on the historicity of Jesus. Do you personally think that Christianity could be a thing without a historical Jesus, or do you think that that is the only way that Christianity could have happened? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I hope you enjoy this part of the interview, and I will see you heathens later. Well, you know, it's I guess a little ironic that you say that, because as I was listening to Tim this morning, he said that mythicists are so emotionally attached to Jesus not existing that we can't let go of it. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, it's been my experience personally that most people that I talk about that agree with the mythicist position aren't emotionally invested in it. Now, in arguments, like I myself have gotten pretty heated in arguments, but I think that's more of indicative of the...
Well, here's the thing. I've seen mythicists that are invested that way. Like they need Jesus not to have existed because they want to beat Christians over the head with it, right? Mm-hmm. So there are, and this is especially true for the cranks, right? Like Joseph Atwill and all his fans, right? So there are mythicists that do have an emotional investment in the non-existence of Jesus, but most of us are not in that place. I used to be a historicist. I'm actually completely fine with that and would love to have good evidence for a particular historical Jesus, because that would be really useful for reconstructing the history of Christianity. So I have no emotional investment in whether Jesus existed or not. And in fact, I end up concluding best odds 1 in 3, which is actually a pretty good chance there was a historical Jesus. You know, more likely he didn't, but 1 in 3 odds that Jesus existed is actually giving pretty good chance to the historical existence of Jesus. So I'm not that invested in the non-existence of Jesus.
Right.
And that's true for most mythicists. In reality, they just want good evidence, and then when the historicists give them crap, they're like, all you're giving us is crap. Like, this is not, or even lies. Sometimes they just lie about the evidence. You look at like Tim ONeill is like making shit up and stuffing it into the background knowledge. So when you look at like who's making stuff up, and you see some of the mythicists are like Joseph Atwill types, and then the Tim ONeill types, and it's like figure, okay, let's eliminate everyone who's making shit up. Right, and say like, this, exclude them. We don't really care about them anymore. We want to only talk about who's not making shit up, who's being honest about the evidence, and then see how historicists in that group and mythicists in that group, how they line up. And who has the stronger arguments among those two groups, and just exclude everybody else. And the reality is when you do that, the historicists, there's none who have any good arguments, and that's very stark, right? It's kind of surprising. In fact, the frequency with which even professional historians will be dishonest about the evidence in defense of historicity is alarming to me. It's like you shouldn't have to do that if you really are confident in your position.
Right.
And so that in and of itself tells you like who's more emotionally invested in this in reality. But yeah, there's a little bit of that on both sides. It's a question of you've got to eliminate people who are on that boat and see what remains when you look at the people who are still being serious and are open to changing their mind. You start to see, I think, I've noticed more and more, the non-emotionally invested historicists start to drift towards at least admitting that mythicism is plausible, even if they don't go all the way to admitting that it's probable.
Right. So do you think that the historicists have more of a lazy kind of thinking? At least, in my opinion, it's really kind of like when I hear them make their arguments, it really seems like very lazy thinking, because, you know, they'll be like, oh, well, there probably was a Jesus that existed that had to start it, and that's the most simple, like that's the simple answer, and they invoke Occam's Razor all the time. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, what do you think about them like saying, oh, well, I think that, you know, that.
Well, there's really two arguments there. And like one is the laziness thing. And I think mostly that's the amateurs on the internet who are defending the historicity of Jesus. There's a lot of lazy thinking there. But if you look at like the real scholars, like Bart Ehrman and stuff like that, I don't think they're lazy thinkers. I just think they're not logically coherent thinkers, and sometimes they're not even honest about the evidence. And I think it's especially with Christian apologists. So I don't think it's laziness. I think it's more there's something else going on there. But the other question is the Occam's Razor thing, and I talk about this. I have a review of Bermejo Rubio's article against Mythicism, which is actually a pretty balanced treatment. But I deal with that on my blog. So you can go to richardcarrier.info and look for Bermejo Rubio, that's his last name, and find my article on that. Or also for people who are interested, there's an article, replies to defenses of historicity, replies to defenders of historicity, which is a complete list of all my blogs about specific people who've argued things. And I keep updating that. So that's a thing to bookmark. Bookmark that, and you'll get easy access to blogs. Eventually, we're going to have all those links and that tree in the Chrestus app. Like we've got a lot of them already, but not all of them. We have to do more updates. But the most recent updated one will be there. And in the Bermejo Rubio case, he makes this argument, the Occam's Razor. Well, it's just simpler. But the reality is it's not, because there's so much weird evidence. And this is the problem. Like you have to explain away a bunch of stuff to get the historical Jesus to exist. One of which is you have to say that the Gospels are lying, that they're hugely exaggerating the fame of Jesus. And a lot of scholars will admit that. They'll say like, yeah, Jesus, the reason there's not a lot of evidence for Jesus is because he wasn't that well known. He wasn't nearly as famous as the Gospels portray. He didn't do a lot of the famous things that are in the Gospels. Or they were at such small scales they didn't get on the historical radar of anyone. But also like the historical Jesus is almost entirely missing in the most literal sense, entirely missing from the authentic letters of Paul. And so you're like, well, why is he's written 20,000 words all about Jesus, never talks about his ministry, never talks about him existing before his appearing, or never talks about anyone knowing him before they see him risen. Never talks about him having preached while alive, never has, or, in his previous existence, never talks about him being an exorcist or a miracle worker, never talks about his parables. So it's just the historical Jesus is gone from Paul's letters. What Paul talks about constantly is this heavenly revelatory being. That's all he ever talks about. It's revelation and scripture. Those are the only sources anyone has. And he's a celestial being, this pre-existent being that became incarnate and underwent this sort of sacrificial event somewhere. He never says where. He never says the Romans did it or the Jews did it or whatever. So if you're a historicist, you have to explain that away. So you have to keep adding these epicycles to your historicity theory to get Jesus, a historical Jesus, to fit the facts. And then when you go back and look at it, those epicycles end up being no less complex than any mythicist has to design. And the way you test that out is when you're doing background, when you're basing your probabilities on background knowledge. The adding of epicycles becomes improbable, right? So that increases or they become balanced. Like it's the same epicycle whether he existed or not, in which case they cancel each other out. And so the question is, when you do that in the end result, where does the balance fall? And so in reality, it's just like the four elements theory versus the periodic table. Like Occam's Razor, counterintuitively, Occam's Razor proves the periodic table. So we've got like 90 plus elements instead of 4. Well, isn't 4 elements simpler? Why? How doesn't the periodic table violate Occam's Razor? Why is that the true one and not the Aristotelian 4-element theory? And the reason is because of all the evidence. The 4-element theory just doesn't explain the evidence well, whereas the periodic table is the simplest theory that explains all the evidence. And so that's how Occam's Razor actually works. And so when you apply it correctly to the Jesus myth historicity debate, you end up leaning towards mythicism because you see that there's actually a simpler mythicist model that explains the evidence better than any of the historicist models, because the evidence is strange, basically.
Right. I always like to think of Occam's Razor as the of two competing theories, the one that has the least amount of assumptions.
And that's where it's key in my book, which is also in the app. Those 48 elements is really important, because a lot of people will say that these are assumptions, but in fact, what I do in the book is I show, no, these are facts. We don't need to assume them. We actually have evidence that they're true.
Right.
And that's just like the periodic table. Like it's based on the not assumptions. It's based on evidence that we have that this is true. Mm-hmm. And so, and those 48 elements are true whether Jesus existed or not. They themselves are not evidence for or against the historicity of Jesus. They're just facts. But those facts change the way we look at the probabilities, because they start to, okay, well, actually, given that, that actually changes everything, right? So if you look at that, that's important. This difference between an assumption versus something you can actually prove is true. And there's an example with the Tim ONeill thing you just brought up, where he's making up these assumptions that Tacitus was using a source written in the 60s that said the thing that he said. For example, this is something he's making up that's not actually in the evidence. We don't know that that's true. And so you can't put things in that you don't know, right? Like that's something he made up. But that's an assumption rather than something you can show true. And what you want to do is you want to eliminate all the assumptions that you can. You never can eliminate them all. A hypothesis is always a construct of assumptions. But that's what makes it a hypothesis. And then you test that set of assumptions against the evidence. And that's what hypothesis testing is. And so you do want to get those assumptions as few as possible, because it keeps your hypothesis simpler. But then you want to put in as much evidence, things that you can prove that aren't assumptions, that you can actually say are actually just true facts. Mm-hmm. And that's sometimes in this debate, people get confused between what is an assumption and what is actually actual background knowledge. And that is a key thing. And then the app will help with that. Right.
Now, another thing that historicists like to do is this appeal to authority. In which, like I said, Tim this morning, he was like, I'm not an expert, but I'm using experts to support my opinion. And I got no problem with that. But he has them on this pedestal of like, can't be wrong. Mm-hmm. And I've noticed that with a lot of historicists is that they put experts on this pedestal of where they can't be wrong. And I can't help but to think about how we rationalized our way through the Old Testament not being based on history. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, obviously historians can be wrong, but it's like, but they're not wrong on Jesus.
Yeah, right. And especially because you can't have progress in knowledge if you start with the assumption that experts can never be wrong. That's dogmatism. That's not empiricism. Obviously, experts can be wrong. If experts weren't wrong, knowledge would never have progressed. We would have just known everything at the start, and we would never have anything to discover. But like you said, the Old Testament is an example of that. The origins of Israel, the Moses question. The experts were all wrong, and it took a long time to sort of admit that and realize that. And then the experts changed their mind, and they changed their mind in response to evidence because they were willing to go and look at the evidence and think about the logic of it. It took a while. A lot of them weren't willing to do that. Some were, but even the ones that were, it took them a while to actually just admit the consequences of all this. It took decades, right, to finally admit all of this. And so we're looking at the same thing in Jesus studies. But the process is supposed to work like this. You get a challenge. You've got a challenge to the consensus. You get it published under peer review. Now, what that does is it establishes that, okay, this is an argument that meets the standards of the field. It's worth your looking at. So it doesn't mean like the peer review doesn't put the stamp of approval like this is true. Mm-hmm. It's just saying like this actually is not crank. It's not amateur. This is like a serious argument that you need to actually examine if you want to be informed on this subject. If you want to continue with your beliefs, your conclusions, you need to make sure that they survive this test. So it's basically a test of the consensus. But if what you do in response to that is no one goes and looks at that book, no one goes and looks at the evidence of it, and just says, no, consensus can't be wrong, you're basically chucking out the entire evidence-based reasoning of your field. You're basically saying that you are defending a religious dogma. You're no longer engaged in the actual process of professional history. Right. And that's the thing is like what you need to see are experts who actually look at the book and actually correctly describe what's in the book, and then reach a conclusion. And so far, that's never happened. Even a lot of the critics of the book never read it and even adamantly refused to read it, which is absurd. And then, of course, they make huge errors about what's in the book. Mm-hmm. And then others who read it incorrectly they make false statements about what's in the book and what's not in the book. Right. And then reach conclusions based on those falsehoods. And this is extremely bizarre and frustrating and shouldn't happen. So it suggests there is some sort of ulterior motive or emotional investment going on here. Like they don't want to confront the real truth of this. And so that's how you respond to that is like you can't just cite experts. Once there's a valid challenge to the consensus, well, those experts now need to go review that challenge and see if their consensus survives it. if they're unwilling to test their consensus position against a challenge, then their consensus position is not reliable. You can just say, like, we can't cite this anymore because they're unwilling to test it. And that's the response I would give to those kinds of arguments.
Yeah. I always, like, whenever I tell people that, like, well, no, it's not that I'm disagreeing. Well, I am disagreeing with the experts, but it's like I have reasons to disagree.
That's right, yeah.
Like, I can explain why they're wrong on this, but they always hold up, like, the experts on as like a pinnacle, and it's like one of the most frustrating things. And like you said, the misrepresentation of, like, what your book is saying, or what I'm saying, is pretty rampant in the debate.
Yeah, it even gets like the experts that they'll cite will say absurdly false things. So it's like E.P. Sanders. I use this example in On the Historicity of Jesus. It's in an early chapter. E.P. Sanders, who's supposed to be one of these experts that can't be wrong, right, declares that there's more evidence for Jesus than there is for Alexander the Great, which is a phenomenally incompetent and false thing to say. It's absurd. It's wildly absurd. So why would you rely on an expert who can't even get a basic fact like that right? And he's even demonstrating that his conclusion that Jesus existed is based on a demonstrably ignorant, false belief about the ancient evidence. That invalidates his expertise. Clearly, his expertise is not helping him here. He's not using his expertise. He's using some sort of, like you said, lazy bullshit to get to his conclusion, rather than doing the work, rather than like what a real historian would do. If you were taking your expertise seriously and actually applying the skills that you're supposed to have learned in college, in grad school, if you say, like, I think there was more evidence for Jesus than for Alexander the Great, but I'm not really sure because I haven't really checked, I should check. Right? You know, like an expert should do that. And of course, when they do that, they'll go like, oh shit, okay, there's shit tons more evidence for Alexander the Great than for Jesus. Okay, that's a bad argument. That's how an expert would act if they were acting using their expertise instead of using their emotions and dogmatism to skip and throw out all the tools they learned in grad school, everything that makes them an expert that's supposed to make them reliable. They're just casting it out and not even using it to reach conclusion, and that invalidates their conclusions. They're not reliable sources anymore at that point.
I heard Tim say this morning that Christianity solely depends on its historical claims, and that it couldn't have existed without Jesus being historical. And I know that you have a completely separate book on this issue called Not the Impossible Faith, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'm kind of curious, how do you respond to that? Well,
it's funny hearing that come from a supposed atheist. Tim ONeill claims to be an atheist. I strongly suspect he's actually a Christian pretending to be an atheist. And here's the reason why. Like, this is another example. That argument is an argument for the resurrection of Jesus, right? Like, if you're going to say, like, Christianity is based on these historical claims, therefore those claims have to be true. Well, you just said that Jesus rose from the dead. Like, how can you be an atheist and have affirmed that? Well, clearly you don't believe that's a logical argument if you're an atheist, right? Like, clearly if you're an atheist, you admit, like, oh yeah, there can be false historical claims, right? And Christianity is based on false historical claims, but that doesn't get you to historicity, because the historicity of Jesus could be false. So that kind of declaration there is super shady to me when I see an supposed atheist say that. But the reality is that if you look at my book, I actually show very plausibly, and I get this from other scholars, it wasn't just me, that you don't, in fact, need a historical Jesus to explain the origins of Christianity. You, in the same way that you don't need a real resurrection to explain the origins of Christianity. You just need the belief in these things. And that's when you look at the order of evidence. The earliest documentation doesn't have a historical Jesus. He's only something people were seeing in visions. So he's a celestial being that you meet in dreams or hallucinations or whatever, or claim to even. But it's a lifetime later, an average lifetime later, that these stories about him walking around Galilee appear. And those stories we have no evidence they existed before that. And then, we have another whole lifetime after that is the first time we start hearing Christians proclaiming that these are absolutely true, that's actually what happened. And you see the transformation in the creed. You look at the creeds in Paul, the version of the creed, it has no reference to Pilate, has no reference to any of those kinds of historical earthly details. But by the time you get to Ignatius, the creeds have suddenly been infused with all of these things you have to believe now to be a real Christian. You have to believe Pilate killed Jesus. You have to believe he was born to someone named Mary. You have to believe he really ate and drank with the disciples. Why is that suddenly in the creed? It wasn't in the creed in Paul's day.
Right.
So like suddenly now you have to believe these things to be a part of this sect. And it's coincidentally, these things are only first reported in the Gospels, which were a lifetime after Paul and a lifetime before Ignatius. So you look at the order of evidence, it looks like fabrication, right? It looks, and then making people basically creating a sect that you have to believe these things to be one of us. And so that's what it looks like. And so this idea that Christianity depends on historical claims is true, but the claims have changed over time. If you look at in Paul, the historical claims that Paul says Christianity is founded on include the fact that God created Jesus as the archangel, the greatest archangel at the beginning of time. Well, does that mean that that's true? Like they believed it was an actual historical event. They believed Satan's rebellion in heaven was an actual historical event. And in fact, the whole religion is based on the assumption that that actually happened. Because if you say that Satan didn't really rebel and didn't really fall to the sky and is governing the world and bringing death in and all the sin and stuff that Jesus has to save you from, if you say that Satan's rebellion in heaven didn't historically exist, you're saying Christianity is false. Now, not modern versions of Christianity, they retooled it. But back then, Christianity made no sense at all, like absolutely zero sense, except on the basis of assuming that the Satan's rebellion was a real historical event. But that doesn't get you to there was actually a Satan's rebellion in heaven. Right? So it's like, so they really believe these things happen, but they're celestial events that they believe supernaturally, mystically, or through scriptures. It's not things that they witnessed and walked around and saw and recorded like historians do, right? So this idea that Christianity is based on historical facts is true, but it just doesn't get you to historicity.
Right.
Or historical claims, I should say.
Right.